All right, so today we're going to dive right into something I'm sure a lot of you are dealing with on a daily basis, and that is managing some of those more challenging student behaviors in the classroom.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We've got a great resource here that we're going to deep dive on to help us out with that,
Absolutely.
and that is the book Strategies for Successful Classroom Management,
I
Helping Students Succeed Without Losing Your Dignity or Sanity.
love the title.
Yeah. And this is by Brian Mendler, Richard L. Kerwin, and Alan N. Mendler. And this was published back in 2008, so it's been around a little while. But all of the concepts are still very relevant today. And, as we were talking about before we hit record, a lot of the challenges that teachers were facing back in 2008 are, some of the same ones that we're seeing in schools now. So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, every year it's something new, right?
yeah, exactly.
But these fundamentals always apply.
Yeah, absolutely. So think of this deep dive as your sort of shortcut to understanding some really effective techniques for diffusing, those challenging moments that can come up,
Yeah.
but also really understanding why students act out the way they do
Yeah.
and, ultimately creating a much more positive learning environment for everyone.
That's what it's all about, right?
Exactly. And the strategies in this book are very practical, and I think that's one of the reasons why it continues to be popular, even though it's, 15 years old at this point.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that makes sense.
So a little bit about the authors here. We've got Brian Mendler, who his background is in special education.
Yep.
And he also did a lot of work with Big Brothers Big Sisters, the Special Olympics.
Well, that's great.
So he has a real good grasp of those, what we might call challenging behaviors and what to do about it. Richard Kerwin,
Yeah.
he is widely respected for his Discipline with Dignity philosophy, which is a whole program, and he's got a best-selling book on that too. And then we've got Alan Mendler, who he's done workshops and seminars. He's been recognized nationally and internationally for his contributions to working with discouraged youth, and he's written a lot of books like What Do I Do When? And Power Struggles.
So these guys have kind of seen it all.
They've really been in the trenches, yeah.
Yeah.
And so what I like about the book is that it kicks off with some powerful and relatable examples of how teachers are actually using these techniques. So one of them is the story of Miss Stevens, who's an 8th grade math teacher.
Okay.
And, they were talking about proportions in her class.
Okay.
And she was trying to explain to the students, how to do a proportion. And a student, Miguel, he just blurted out and said, "You're too skinny to know anything about proportions."
Oh, wow.
Which, if I was her, I would have been just mortified and upset.
Yeah, what do you even say to that?
Exactly. But Miss Stevens, instead of losing her cool, she kind of looked him right in the eye. And she said, "You know what, Miguel? You're probably right. But luckily I'm married to a man who really knows his proportions."
All right, I like where this is going.
And she said, "You know what? I think I'm going to go home tonight and I'm going to tell my husband that you said I was too skinny.
Oh, smart.
And I bet you anything he's going to feel so bad for me, he's going to let me cancel all of your homework for tonight."
Oh, wow. So she turned it into a win for the class.
Exactly. And the students just loved it.
Yeah.
They thought it was so funny. And, Miguel even, kind of chuckled along with them. And it really diffused the situation that could have very easily gone south.
Totally. Yeah, I could see that happening.
And then another example is Mrs. Hall, who is a 77-year-old teacher. And she was, teaching her class. And she's
Right.
up at the front of the room. And a student Bill just blurts out, "What are you looking at my crotch for?"
Oh, gosh. I mean,
I can't even imagine.
77 years old and a student says something like that to you.
Nice.
I mean, I don't even know what I would do.
But Mrs. Hall, she just kind of looked at him with a little twinkle in her eye, and she said very calmly,
Okay.
"No, I was just counting."
Oh, my gosh.
And the class just erupted in laughter. Bill was totally embarrassed.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
The respect for her that he had in that moment just shot through the roof because she handled it so expertly.
That's amazing. She's got nerves of steel.
Yeah, she really does.
That's great.
And so what these anecdotes show us, and what's important for all of you listeners out there, is that these teachers used skill.
Yeah.
They used determination, and they used courage to navigate these really difficult situations in a way that de-escalated tension,
For sure.
kept the focus on learning, and ultimately kept the kids in the class.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so important that we remember that.
And that's actually what this book is all about.
Okay.
Is keeping students in class and getting back to teaching.
Yeah, that's the goal.
That's the goal. So we're going to explore today some really practical methods that you can use to manage these challenging behaviors effectively without just, kicking the kids out of class every time something happens.
Right, right. Because that doesn't really solve anything in the long run.
Exactly. So let's kind of start off by getting into the bigger picture a little bit,
Right.
because the book talks about this problem of harmful aggression
Yeah,
and some of the societal influences that are really kind of feeding into this.
absolutely.
So what are some of those big picture things that they talk about?
Well, they start off by, acknowledging that aggression isn't, something crazy. It is part of human nature, right?
We all have that capacity within us.
We do. We do. And they even talk about how, we have healthy outlets for aggression like sports.
Yeah, for sure.
But then they contrast that with this really powerful anecdote.
Okay.
Some of the authors were talking to Miami-Dade police officers, and these officers said that they actually found teaching emotionally challenged students more stressful and more dangerous
Right.
than being on patrol in high crime areas.
That's really saying something.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, and it makes you really think about the challenges that we're up against in the classroom.
Wow. And so what are some of the underlying reasons for this heightened aggression?
Well, one of the big ones that they point to is just the instability that a lot of kids are experiencing outside of school.
Okay.
Troubled homes, a lot of moving around.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they cite a statistic from 2003
Okay.
that over 500,000 third graders had attended more than 3 different schools
Wow.
between first and third grade.
That's a lot of transitions.
It's a ton. And think about the impact on those kids.
Right.
Each time they move, they can fall behind academically by 4 to 6 months.
Oh, for sure.
And they're also much less likely to graduate high school.
Wow. So, I mean, if we think about that in terms of, what you're doing in the classroom every day,
Yeah.
that can help explain some of those behavioral issues.
It can, because, when a child's life is just constant chaos and uncertainty,
Yeah.
then school can become, another source of stress instead of that safe, stable place that it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And they also talk about the influence of gangs, right?
Are they-
Which can kind of become like substitute families for some students.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true.
And the increasing danger in schools due to just easy access to weapons now.
Yeah, it's a scary reality.
It really is. And then, of course, we can't ignore the role of media in all of this.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right, because the book talks about how harmful aggression is really glamorized,
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It is, and it's constantly exposing young people to this violence. And they actually point out that on average, parents spend 6.5 minutes per week in meaningful conversation with their children.
Wow.
And those same children are watching 28 hours of television per week.
That's a huge difference.
It is a huge difference. And, a lot of that television is filled with violence. So by the time a kid finishes elementary school, they may have actually seen thousands of murders on TV.
It's disturbing when you think about it that way.
It really is. And so I think that's an important question for all of you listening out there is, what are the messages that your students are constantly bombarded with outside of school? Because that definitely comes into the classroom with them.
Oh, absolutely.
And then they also talk about the impact of, violent video games and movies.
Yeah.
And they even mention natural born killers
Right.
in relation to the Columbine shooting.
Wow.
Not to say that movie caused the Columbine shooting,
Yeah.
but to kind of highlight this unhealthy relationship
Yeah.
that some individuals have with these violent media and how it might desensitize them to aggression.
Right, and make it seem more acceptable.
Exactly. And it's not just about the overt violence.
Yeah.
They also talk about how commercials are often promoting instant gratification.
Right.
The idea that status comes from having things.
Yeah, and wanting things now,
Exactly.
not having to work for them.
Yeah, and I think, as teachers, we see that all the time, right? This lack of patience, this wanting to get to the end result without actually doing any of the work.
Exactly. And they talk about a shift in role models, too.
Okay.
Moving from athletes who are known for their hard work and dedication
Okay.
to these poker players who achieve, instant wealth and fame
Right.
just by, basically gambling.
So it's kind of like that lottery mentality almost.
Yeah.
And that can definitely affect, a student's patience and perseverance in the classroom.
Oh, absolutely.
And then they connect all of this to, kind of a larger global picture.
Yeah.
They talk about the rise of intolerance
Yeah.
and violence as these acceptable ways of solving problems.
Yeah, it's happening all over the world.
It is. And so they're saying, given this context, schools really have a vital role to play in teaching kids better ways to handle conflict and aggression.
Yeah, we have to be the counterbalance to all of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really powerful message for educators is that, we're not just teaching, writing and arithmetic.
Right.
We're actually teaching kids how to be decent human beings.
We are. And that's a huge responsibility.
It is. Now, it's important to understand that the authors aren't blaming, literature and plays and schools themselves for aggression.
Okay.
In fact, they actually advocate for teaching curriculum that really connects with students so that, they're engaged in the learning and they're not just, bored and looking for trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's when things can escalate.
Exactly. But they are acknowledging this reality of aggression in schools and the school's role as a, safe and supportive environment for kids.
Yeah, that's so important.
They also touch on these, tough choices that schools have to make when it comes to resources, like athletic facilities versus updated textbooks. And they really emphasize the need to make the most of the time you have with students to teach positive behaviors.
Yeah, because every minute counts.
Every minute counts.
Yeah.
So this all kind of sets the stage for, what we're going to talk about today.
Okay.
Which is that, despite all these significant external factors that we've just talked about, you as an educator still hold a tremendous amount of power.
Yeah, you can make a real difference.
You can make a real difference within your own classroom. So let's talk about some of those essential attitudes, beliefs, and principles that the book suggests effective educators should cultivate.
All right, so we're talking about mindset now.
Exactly.
Right.
Mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are some of those key mindsets that the book really champions?
One of the most important ones, and I think something for you to really take to heart,
Okay.
is that effective teaching means working with all students.
Right.
Not just the good ones.
Not just the easy ones.
Yeah, not just the ones who are already, ready to learn.
Yeah.
It's about reaching every single kid in your classroom, including the ones who present challenges.
And those are often the ones who need us the most, right?
They are.
Because they're the ones who are struggling and they're the ones who are acting out and...
Yeah, and they're the ones who need our skill and our patience the most.
Absolutely. And I think another really crucial attitude to cultivate is that ability to stay personally connected with your students.
Okay.
Well, without taking their challenging behavior personally.
Right, because that's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
But it's so important.
Because it's so easy to get, wrapped up in that.
Yeah.
When a kid is acting out and it feels like it's directed at you.
Yeah.
But the book really stresses the importance of responding effectively and professionally.
Right.
Without becoming defensive or attacking back.
Yeah, and that takes a lot of emotional maturity.
It does.
And self-regulation on our part.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to detach a little bit emotionally in the moment, but still maintain that underlying care and connection with the student.
Right, because you still care about them.
Right.
But you can't let their behavior, throw you off your game.
Exactly. And the good news is that the book assures us that we can learn to do this.
We can.
That educators can actually learn the confidence and the specific skills they need to diffuse these potentially volatile situations.
That's encouraging to hear.
It is. So it's not, something you're born with or you're not.
Right.
It's something that you can learn and develop over time.
Yeah, through practice and experience.
Exactly. So now that we've kind of talked about, the bigger picture and the right mindset, let's talk about why kids misbehave in the first place.
Okay.
Because the book breaks this down into 4 categories.
It does.
That are really insightful. So let's go through those.
All right. So the 4 categories are lack of awareness.
Okay.
Belief of being stupid or hopeless.
Okay.
Students who want to look good in front of their friends. And students who are seeking attention.
Okay. So let's break those down one by one. So the first one, lack of awareness. I mean, that can show up in so many ways in the classroom.
It really can.
So what are some examples of that?
Well, the book has this great anecdote about a professor. I'm just going to call him Bill, just to keep it simple.
Okay.
He was teaching French vocabulary, colors and numbers.
Okay.
And he overhears these students excitedly discussing a Yankees game.
Okay.
And his first reaction is, frustration.
They should be paying attention to me.
Right. Exactly.
Not to the Yankees.
Exactly. But the book actually suggests that Bill missed an opportunity there.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because he could have used their enthusiasm for the game as a bridge to the lesson.
I like that.
Yeah, How do you say Yankees in French? What color are their uniforms? What was the score?
Right.
Bringing their world into the classroom.
That's so smart. And I think so often as teachers, we get so focused on, delivering our curriculum exactly as planned
Yes.
that we miss those opportunities to really make a genuine connection.
We do. We do. And that's where the magic happens.
It is. And so, sometimes those off-topic conversations are actually a gift
They can be.
if we can figure out how to weave them back into the learning.
Yeah, that's the key.
So I love that that's a great takeaway. So the second reason for misbehavior,
Okay.
belief of being stupid or hopeless.
Yeah, this one's a tough one.
It is a tough one because it really speaks to a student's sense of self in the classroom, right?
Absolutely.
So what did I say about that?
Well, they share a story about a Spanish class
Okay.
taught by Ms. Williams.
Okay.
And she did this interesting thing to address chronic lateness.
Okay.
But it had this really unexpected positive impact on students' belief in their own abilities.
Okay, so she was trying to solve one problem, but it ended up solving a bigger problem.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
So what she did was she gave an easy A
Okay.
to students who are consistently on time
I like that.
for vocabulary quizzes.
Okay, so explain how that worked.
So every Monday, she would introduce 10 new Spanish words. And she would display them with English translation at the beginning of class for 3 minutes.
Okay.
Tuesday, students would copy those words down.
Okay.
Wednesday was an open book quiz on those 10 words.
Gotcha.
Thursday, she would introduce a new set of 10 words.
Okay.
And Friday was a closed book quiz on all 20 words for the week.
Wow. That's a lot of quizzes.
It is, but it's low stakes, right?
Okay.
Because the Wednesday quiz is open book.
So they're almost guaranteed to get 100%
Exactly.
if they do the work.
If they do the work. And here's the kicker.
Okay.
There was absolutely no sharing of notes allowed.
Okay.
And the consequence for sharing was that all the quizzes for the rest of the week would be closed book for everyone.
Oh, so it's a group consequence.
It is. It is.
Interesting.
And the
Okay.
results were really dramatic.
So what happened?
Almost immediately, kids who were chronically late started making an effort to be on time,
Just so they could copy down the words.
just so they could copy down the words
Yeah.
and get that guaranteed 100% on Wednesday.
Wow, so it really incentivized them to be there.
It did. It did.
That's pretty clever.
There was one student in particular,
Okay.
17-year-old named Juan, who had failed beginning Spanish twice before.
Okay.
He got his very first 100% ever.
Wow. Good for him.
Yeah. And he even started encouraging his friend to be on time.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah. His whole attitude about Spanish changed.
Wow.
His grades got better, and he ended up passing the course with an 88%.
That's amazing. So it wasn't just about the grade itself.
No.
It was really about building confidence.
It was.
And then also that repeated exposure to the vocabulary actually helped him learn it.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about this.
Yeah.
That she addressed that feeling of hopelessness by giving them a clear, attainable path to early success.
Right.
And it really changed everything.
And I bet she saw a difference in their behavior too.
Oh, I'm sure she did, yeah.
Because they felt good about themselves.
Exactly.
They felt capable.
But felt like they could do it.
Yeah, that's a powerful lesson. So the third category of misbehavior is students who are driven by the desire to look good.
Yeah.
Or, keep up their social standing in front of their friends.
Right.
Especially middle school, high school. We see that all the time.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
So what are some tips for dealing with that?
Well, the book says to avoid correcting students in front of their peers.
Okay, so don't call them out in front of everybody.
Yeah, don't embarrass them because that's just going to make things worse.
Right, right.
They're going to feel like they have to defend themselves.
Yeah, they got to save face.
They got to save face.
So talk to them privately later.
Exactly.
Okay, good tip. And the book actually shares an anecdote about one of the authors,
Okay.
BDM, and he talks about when he was a kid, he was afraid to play tackle football.
Oh.
And his mom was like, just tell him I won't let you play.
Smart mom.
Yeah, so that he wouldn't look scared in front of his friends.
Yeah, so he had a cover.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And so the book encourages us to think about that when a student's, acting out. Sometimes they're just trying to save face.
Right.
And so, something as simple as whatever, that we might take as disrespect
Right.
might actually just be them trying to, not look vulnerable in front of their friends.
Yeah. And we have to recognize that.
Exactly. And so the best response in that moment is often to not take the bait,
Right. Just let it go.
let it go, and then address it later.
Exactly.
Okay, so the fourth category is students who are seeking attention.
Yeah. And this one can be tricky
It can be tricky because it can look like so many different things,
It can.
you know, from subtle disruptions to, full-blown tantrums.
Right.
So what are some ways to deal with that?
Well, the book talks about BDM's experience teaching earth science.
Okay.
And he was doing this lesson that a lot of kids were finding confusing.
Okay.
And this student, Lewis,
Okay.
threw a paper airplane and then stood up on his desk,
Oh, wow.
like mocking the lesson,
Trying to get a laugh.
trying to get attention. Yeah.
Okay.
But the teacher's response was really interesting.
Okay, so what did he do?
Instead of getting angry,
Okay.
he turned the disruption into a classroom activity.
Oh, okay. I like that.
Yeah, he asked everyone to take out a piece of paper and make their best paper airplane,
Nice.
except Luis,
Oh,
because Luis clearly already knew how to make one.
Oh, I love that.
And then after everyone had made their airplanes,
Okay.
he asked Luis to help lead the activity.
Oh, so we gave him a job.
He gave him a job.
I love that.
Yeah, he had Luis, tell everyone to clear their desks,
Okay.
help measure how far the airplanes flew,
Okay.
write the measurements on the board.
So he was like the assistant teacher almost.
He was. He was. And even when Luis was a little resistant at first,
Okay.
the teacher didn't argue with him.
Oh.
He just said, well, if you're not interested, I'll find someone else who is.
Oh, that's good.
So it kind of appealed to Luis's desire to be important,
Right.
to be needed.
And it kept him engaged in a positive way.
Exactly.
And it let the lesson continue. That's fantastic. I mean, that's really brilliant classroom management there.
It is. It is.
So it's all about, figuring out what the student's underlying need is.
Yeah.
And then finding a way to meet that need
In a positive way.
in a positive way that also allows you to keep teaching.
Yeah. And keep him in the class.
And keep them in the class.
Right.
Exactly. All right. So we've talked a lot about, why kids misbehave.
Yeah.
Let's move on to a concept that I think often causes some confusion,
Okay.
but is so important for classroom management.
Right. With that.
And that is the difference between fair and equal.
Okay. This is a big one.
It is a big one.
Yeah.
And the book dedicates a lot of time to this. So let's kind of unpack that for everyone.
Okay.
So, the book keeps reminding us that our two main goals are to keep kids in class and get back to teaching.
Right. Those are the non-negotiables.
Exactly. And they say that focusing only on the appearance of fairness,
Okay.
that is treating every student exactly the same,
Right.
can actually be really counterproductive.
Yeah, because not all kids are the same.
Exactly. So equal treatment does not always equal fair treatment.
That's right.
And so they actually define fairness as giving each individual student what they need to be successful.
To thrive,
Whereas equality is just treating everyone the same,
regardless of their needs.
regardless of their needs. Yeah.
Right.
And so they use a really good analogy.
Okay. I like analogies.
Yeah, me too. They use a pizza analogy.
Okay.
So if two people order a 10-slice pizza,
Okay.
treating them equally would mean each person gets 5 slices.
Okay. 5 and 5.
5 and 5. But treating them fairly would mean each person eats until they're satisfied.
Okay.
So if one person is full after 3 slices,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be fair to make them eat 2 more.
Right. Just to make it even.
Just to make it even, exactly.
That makes sense.
And they also suggest talking to your students about, things at home
Okay.
where, maybe siblings were treated differently, but fairly, different allowances.
Yeah. Different bedtimes. Different chores.
Different chores, exactly.
Yeah.
But it was fair because it was based on their age and their maturity level.
Right.
And I think kids can relate to that.
Yeah, they get it.
And they actually give you some really great sample dialogue for when a student inevitably complains, that's not fair.
Oh, yeah. We've all heard that one.
Right. Instead of getting defensive,
Yeah.
the book suggests acknowledging the student's feeling
Gotcha.
and then asking them to suggest a better solution.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Right. So you're kind of putting the onus back on them.
Right. To come up with a solution.
Exactly.
Instead of just complaining.
Exactly. And so they even outline the 3 most likely student responses to this question.
Okay. Let's hear them.
So the student might say, yes, I have a better solution.
Okay.
They might say, no, I don't.
Okay.
Or they might say, I don't know.
Okay.
And the book gives you clear and appropriate teacher follow-up strategies for each of those responses.
So they've got you covered no matter what the kid says.
Exactly. So it's like a little cheat sheet almost.
I like it.
And, for example, if a student says, well, I think it would help if you called my parents,
Yeah.
the teacher could say, okay, I'll agree to do that. And then let's see if it makes a difference.
Right. So you're actually taking action
They're taking action
based on their suggestion.
based on their suggestion. And I think that shows the student that you're listening to them
Does?
and that you're taking them seriously.
Right.
And then they also recommend some proactive steps.
Okay.
So like writing the definitions of fair and equal on the board,
Okay.
informing parents about this distinction at the beginning of the year,
Right.
and reassuring them that all students will be treated fairly,
Yeah.
according to their needs,
Right.
but it might not always look equal.
Right.
And that you're not going to discuss individual student situations with other parents.
Right. To protect everyone's privacy.
Protect everyone's privacy, exactly. So clear communication with both your students and their parents is really key here.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now let's move on to some specific classroom strategies that the book highlights.
Okay, let's get practical.
Let's get practical. Yeah. So what are some of those things that teachers can actually do in their classroom?
Well, one of the most important ones is building strong, positive relationships with your students.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the foundation of everything, right?
It is.
When kids feel connected to you,
Yeah.
they feel valued, they feel like you care about them,
Yeah.
they're less likely to act out.
They're less likely to cause trouble.
Yeah, and it's not just about being friendly.
Right.
It's about really listening to your students, making learning relevant to their lives.
Right, and setting them up for success.
Setting them up for success.
Exactly. We were talking about earlier with that Yankees game.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, finding those connections to their interests.
absolutely. And creating a classroom atmosphere that's supportive and fun.
Yes.
You know, learning should be enjoyable.
It should be.
And then also establishing clear, consistent, basic procedures.
Okay, so like routines and expectations.
Exactly. You know, so that kids know what to expect.
Yeah, that makes things run more smoothly.
It does, it does.
And it prevents a lot of those little disruptions.
Exactly. And then also the book really stresses believing in every student's capacity for success.
Yeah.